The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. The judge sat high on his bench, his face stern, his eyes sharp as he looked over the papers in front of him. The woman standing before him looked ordinary, plain clothes, no makeup, her hair tied back simply. She didn't look like someone who would cause a stir, but here she was, in the middle of a legal battle that had already dragged on for months. The case was about a piece of land. The woman claimed it belonged to her family for generations, but the other side, a wealthy businessman, argued he had bought it fair and square. The evidence seemed to favor the businessman. He had documents, signatures, and even witnesses who backed his claim. The woman, on the other hand, had little more than her word and a few old photos. The judge listened carefully as both sides presented their arguments. The businessman's lawyer was smooth, confident, and well-prepared. He spoke about contracts, legal ownership, and the importance of upholding the law. When it was the woman's turn, her voice was quiet but steady. She spoke about her family, her childhood memories on that land, and how it was the only thing left of her heritage. The judge's face didn't change as he listened. He had heard countless stories like this before, emotional appeals, claims of injustice, and people fighting for what they believed was rightfully theirs. But the law was the law, and emotions couldn't change facts. When both sides finished, the judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He glanced at the woman, then at the businessman, and finally at the stack of documents in front of him. After a long pause, he spoke. Based on the evidence presented, he began, his voice firm, I rule in favor of the plaintiff. The land legally belongs to him. The businessman's face lit up with a satisfied smile. His lawyer patted him on the back, whispering congratulations. The woman, however, stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. She didn't cry or protest. She just stood there, her eyes fixed on the judge, as if waiting for something more. The judge noticed her gaze and frowned slightly. Is there something else? He asked, his tone impatient. The woman took a deep breath. Your Honor, she said quietly, there's something you need to know. The judge raised an eyebrow. If you have new evidence, it should have been presented earlier. The case is closed. It's not about the case, she said, her voice still calm but with a hint of something deeper, something that made the judge pause. Then what is it? He asked, his curiosity piqued despite himself. The woman hesitated for a moment, then straightened her shoulders. Your Honor, she said, I didn't want it to come to this, but you've left me no choice. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn envelope. This is for you. The judge stared at her, then at the envelope. He gestured for the bailiff to bring it to him. As he opened it, the room seemed to grow even quieter, as if everyone sensed that something big was about to happen. Inside the envelope was a single photograph. The judge's eyes widened as he looked at it. It was an old picture, faded with time, but the faces were clear. In the photo, a young man in a military uniform stood beside a woman holding a baby. The young man was smiling, his arm around the woman protectively. The judge's hands trembled slightly as he stared at the photo. He recognized the young man instantly. It was his father. He looked up at the woman, his face pale. Who are you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman met his gaze, her eyes steady. I'm your sister, she said. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. The businessman's smile vanished, replaced by confusion and disbelief. The judge sat frozen, his mind racing. He had grown up an only child, raised by his father after his mother passed away. His father had never mentioned another child, a daughter. But the photo was undeniable. The resemblance between the woman and his father was uncanny. And the baby in the photo, could it really be her? The judge's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, shock, disbelief, and a growing sense of guilt. He had just ruled against his own sister, without even knowing who she was. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" he asked, his voice strained. "I tried," she said softly. "But no one would listen. I thought if I could prove the land was mine, it would be enough. But when you ruled against me, I had no choice but to tell you the truth." The judge looked down at the photo again, his heart heavy. He had spent his entire career upholding the law, believing in justice and fairness. But now, faced with the truth, he realized that sometimes the law wasn't enough. Sometimes, there were things that went deeper, things like family, heritage, and the bonds that tied people together. He took a deep breath and stood up, his decision made. "This court is adjourned," he announced. "I need time to review this new information. We will reconvene tomorrow." As the bailiff called for order and the crowd began to disperse, the judge stepped down from his bench and approached the woman. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. "We have a lot to talk about," he said finally. She nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and sadness. "Yes," she said. "We do." And with that, the first chapter of their story began, a story of family, secrets, and the search for truth in a world where nothing is ever as simple as it seems. The judge's chambers were quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded in the courtroom. He sat behind his desk, the old photograph still in his hands, staring at it as if it might reveal more secrets if he looked hard enough. The woman, his sister, sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm but guarded. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, and neither knew quite where to begin. Finally, the judge broke the silence. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice low and measured. "About you," she replied. "For a few years now. After our father passed away, I found some old letters and documents. That's when I realized I had a brother." The judge frowned. "Why didn't you reach out sooner?" She sighed, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I wanted to. But I didn't know how. You're a judge, a respected man. I'm just me. I didn't think you'd believe me, or even care." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had always prided himself on being fair and just, but now he wondered if he had become so focused on the law that he had forgotten about the people behind it. "Tell me everything," he said, leaning forward. "Start from the beginning." And so she did. She told him about their father, a man who had been kind but distant, a man who had carried the weight of his past in silence. She explained how their mother had died when she was just a baby, leaving their father to raise her alone. But life had been hard, and their father had struggled to make ends meet. When she was still young, he had made the difficult decision to send her to live with relatives, hoping she would have a better life. "He visited me when he could," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. But as the years went by, the visits became less frequent. Eventually, they stopped altogether. "I didn't know why until I found the letters. That's when I learned about you." The judge listened intently, his mind racing. He had always believed he was an only child, raised by a single father who had never remarried. His father had rarely spoken about the past, and when he did, it was always vague. Now, he realized there had been so much more to the story, a story his father had kept hidden for reasons he could only guess at. "Why did he keep us apart?" the judge asked, his voice tinged with frustration. She shook her head. "I don't know for sure. Maybe he thought it was for the best. Maybe he was ashamed. All I know is that he loved us both, in his own way." The judge leaned back in his chair, his mind swirling with questions and emotions. He felt anger at his father for keeping this secret, sadness for the sister he had never known, and guilt for the way he had treated her in court. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice heavy with regret. "If I had known. You couldn't have known, she interrupted gently. And I didn't want to use this against you. I just wanted what was rightfully mine. The judge nodded, his thoughts turning back to the case. The land in question had been in their family for generations, a piece of their heritage that had been passed down from father to child. But somewhere along the way, the ownership had become muddled, and the businessman had swooped in, claiming it as his own. We'll fix this, the judge said firmly. I'll reopen the case. We'll find a way to prove the land belongs to you. She smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. It's not just about the land, she said. It's about our family. About the time we've lost. I don't want to fight anymore. I just want to know my brother. Her words struck a chord deep within him. For so long, he had defined himself by his career, by his reputation as a fair and impartial judge. But now, faced with the sister he never knew he had, he realized there was more to life than the law. We'll figure this out, he said, his voice softer now. Together. They talked for hours, sharing stories about their father, their lives, and the paths that had led them to this moment. As the afternoon turned to evening, the judge felt a sense of connection he hadn't known he was missing. But even as they bonded, the shadow of the case loomed over them. The businessman wasn't going to give up the land without a fight, and the judge knew he would have to tread carefully. He couldn't let his personal feelings interfere with his duty as a judge, but he also couldn't ignore the truth. As they parted ways that evening, the judge promised to do everything in his power to make things right. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be easy. The road ahead was fraught with challenges, and the secrets of the past were only just beginning to surface. The next morning, the judge arrived at the courthouse early, his mind still reeling from the previous day's revelations. He had spent the night tossing and turning, torn between his duty as a judge and his newfound role as a brother. The weight of the decision he had to make pressed heavily on his shoulders. As he sat in his chambers, reviewing the case files, there was a knock on the door. It was the businessman's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man with a confident air. Your Honor, the lawyer began, I understand there's been some new developments in the case. My client is concerned about the delay and would like to know when we can expect a final ruling. The judge looked up, his expression unreadable. The case is under review, he said evenly. I'll make a decision when I'm satisfied that all the facts have been considered. The lawyer hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. With all due respect, Your Honor, the evidence is clear. My client has a legal claim to the land. Any further delay seems unnecessary. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. Justice isn't about speed, he said firmly. It's about getting it right. You can assure your client that I'll make my decision as soon as possible. The lawyer nodded, though his frustration was evident. Very well, Your Honor. I'll let him know. After the lawyer left, the judge leaned back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. He knew the businessman had a strong case on paper, but the truth, the real truth, was far more complicated. The land wasn't just a piece of property, it was a piece of his family's history, a connection to a past he was only beginning to understand. Later that day, he met with his sister again. She looked tired, as if the weight of the situation was taking its toll on her as well. Any progress? She asked hopefully. Not yet, he admitted. But I'm doing everything I can. The problem is, the law is clear. Unless we can prove that the documents the businessman has are fraudulent or that there was some kind of mistake, it's going to be hard to overturn the ruling. She nodded, her expression resigned. I understand. I don't want to lose the only thing I have left of our family. Her words struck a chord deep within him. He had spent his entire life building a career, achieving success, and earning respect. But now, faced with the possibility of losing a piece of his heritage, he realized how much it meant to him. There's something I need to ask you, he said after a moment. Do you have any other evidence? Anything that might help us prove the land belongs to our family? She thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. There might be something. Our father kept a lot of old papers, deeds, letters, things like that. I have some of them, but I'm not sure if they'll be enough. It's worth a try, he said. Bring them to me. We'll go through everything together. Over the next few days, they pored over the documents, searching for anything that might help their case. It was painstaking work, but slowly, a picture began to emerge. They found an old deed, handwritten and faded with age, that seemed to confirm the land had been passed down through their family for generations. There were letters from their father, mentioning the land and his hopes of keeping it in the family. And there were photographs, showing the land as it had been decades ago, with their family's name proudly displayed on a sign at the entrance. But even with all this evidence, the judge knew it wouldn't be enough on its own. The businessman's documents were newer, more official, and backed by witnesses who claimed the land had been sold legally. We need more, the judge said finally, frustration creeping into his voice. Something that proves the sale was invalid. His sister hesitated, then spoke softly. There's one more thing. But it's complicated. The judge looked at her, his curiosity piqued. What is it? She took a deep breath. Before our father passed away, he told me something. He said there was a man, a lawyer, who had helped him with the land years ago. But something went wrong. The lawyer disappeared, and our father never trusted anyone with the land again. The judge's eyes widened. Do you think this lawyer might have had something to do with the sale? I don't know, she admitted. But it's possible. If we could find him, maybe he could tell us what really happened. The judge nodded, a spark of hope igniting within him. Then we'll find him. No matter what it takes. And so, the search began. They reached out to old contacts, scoured records, and followed every lead they could find. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. As they worked together, the bond between them grew stronger. They shared stories about their father, their childhoods, and the lives they had built apart from each other. For the first time, the judge felt a sense of belonging he hadn't known he was missing. But even as they grew closer, the shadow of the case loomed over them. The businessman was growing impatient, and the judge knew time was running out. If they didn't find the search for the missing lawyer became an all-consuming mission. The judge and his sister spent every spare moment following leads, making phone calls, and digging through old records. It was exhausting work, but neither of them was willing to give up. Their first breakthrough came when they tracked down an old friend of their father's, a man who had known him for decades. He was hesitant to talk at first, but when the judge explained the situation, his demeanor softened. Your father was a good man, the old friend said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. But he had his share of troubles. That lawyer you're looking for, his name was Thomas. He was supposed to help your father with the land, but something went wrong. I don't know the details, but your father never trusted him again. Do you know where we can find him? The judge asked, leaning forward eagerly. The old man shook his head. He disappeared years ago. Rumor has it he left town after some kind of scandal. But if anyone knows where he is, it's probably his old secretary. She worked with him for years. With this new lead, the judge and his sister set out to find the secretary. It wasn't easy, she had retired years ago and moved to a small town a few hours away, but they eventually tracked her down. When they arrived at her modest home, she greeted them with a warm smile, though her eyes held a hint of caution. I wondered if someone would come asking about Thomas, she said as she invited them inside. Over cups of tea, she told them everything she knew. Thomas had been a respected lawyer once, but he had gotten involved in some shady dealings. He had helped several clients with questionable transactions, including the sale of land that didn't belong to them. Your father came to him for help, the secretary explained. He wanted to make sure the land stayed in the family. But Thomas saw an opportunity. He forged documents, manipulated the records, and sold the land to the highest bidder. By the time your father realized what had happened, it was too late. The judge's sister clenched her fists, her face pale with anger. Why didn't he do something? Why didn't he fight back? The secretary sighed. He tried. But Thomas had powerful friends, and your father was just one man. He didn't have the resources to take him on. In the end, he had no choice but to let it go. The judge felt a surge of anger and frustration. His father had been betrayed by someone he trusted, and the consequences had haunted him for the rest of his life. "Do you know where Thomas is now?" the judge asked, his voice tight with emotion. The secretary hesitated, then nodded. "He's living under a different name in a small town up north. He's kept a low profile, but I've heard rumors. If you want to find him, I can give you the address." With the address in hand, the judge and his sister set off on the long drive north. The journey was quiet, both of them lost in their thoughts. The judge couldn't help but wonder what they would find when they reached their destination. Would Thomas be willing to help them? Or would he deny everything and disappear again? When they finally arrived at the small, run-down house, the judge felt a mix of anticipation and dread. He knocked on the door, and after a long pause, it creaked open. The man who answered looked nothing like the slick lawyer from the stories. He was older, his hair gray and thinning, his face lined with years of regret. When he saw the judge and his sister, his eyes widened in recognition and fear. "Who are you?" he asked, though it was clear he already knew. "We're here to talk about my father," the judge said, his voice steady but firm. "And the land you stole from him." Thomas's face paled, and for a moment, it looked like he might slam the door shut. But then he sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I knew this day would come," he said quietly. "Come in. We need to talk." Inside the dimly lit house, Thomas told them everything. He admitted to forging the documents, manipulating the records, and selling the land to the businessmen. He had done it for money, he said, but the guilt had eaten away at him ever since. "I've spent years trying to forget what I did," he said, his voice trembling. "But I can't. I know I can't make it right, but if there's anything I can do to help you now, I will." The judge exchanged a glance with his sister. This was the break they had been hoping for. With Thomas's testimony, they might finally be able to prove the land belonged to their family. But as they left the house, the judge couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still ahead. They had the truth, but convincing the court, and the businessmen, wouldn't be easy. With Thomas's confession in hand, the judge and his sister returned to the courthouse, determined to set things right. But they knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The businessman had deep pockets and a team of skilled lawyers, and he wasn't going to give up the land without a fight. The first step was to file a motion to reopen the case. The judge, careful to avoid any appearance of bias, recused himself from presiding over the proceedings. Instead, he handed the case over to a trusted colleague, a no-nonsense judge known for her fairness and integrity. The hearing was tense. The businessmen's lawyers argued that the case had already been decided and that reopening it would set a dangerous precedent. They dismissed Thomas's confession as the ramblings of a disgraced man trying to clear his conscience. But the judge's sister, now represented by a determined young lawyer, stood her ground. She presented the old deed, the letters, and the photographs, painting a vivid picture of the land's history and its importance to her family. And then, she called Thomas to the stand. The courtroom fell silent as Thomas took his seat. He looked nervous, his hands trembling as he swore to tell the truth. But as he began to speak, his voice grew stronger, his words filled with regret and resolve. He admitted to forging the documents and manipulating the records. He described how he had betrayed the judge's father, selling the land to the businessman for a fraction of its worth. And he apologized, not just to the judge and his sister, but to the memory of their father. The businessman's lawyers tried to discredit him, questioning his motives and his credibility. But Thomas held firm, his testimony unwavering. When it was the businessman's turn to speak, he was defiant. "This is nothing but a desperate attempt to take what's rightfully mine," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I bought that land fair and square, and I won't let some old man's lies take it away from me." But the judge's sister wasn't intimidated. "It's not about the land," she said, her voice steady and strong. "It's about justice. It's about honoring my father's memory and protecting our family's legacy. And I won't stop fighting until the truth is known." The judge, watching from the back of the courtroom, felt a surge of pride. His sister, who had seemed so quiet and unassuming at first, had become a force to be reckoned with. After hours of arguments and testimony, the judge overseeing the case called for a recess. She needed time to review the evidence and make her decision. The wait was agonizing. The judge and his sister sat together in the courthouse hallway, their nerves on edge. They had done everything they could, but they knew the outcome was out of their hands. Finally, the bailiff called them back into the courtroom. The judge took her seat, her expression unreadable, and the room fell silent. After reviewing the evidence and hearing the testimony, she began, her voice clear and authoritative, "I have decided to reopen the case. The new evidence presented raises serious questions about the validity of the land sale, and it is in the interest of justice to examine these claims further." The businessman's face turned red with anger, but he said nothing. His lawyers exchanged worried glances, clearly realizing they were in for a tougher fight than they had anticipated. The judge's sister let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. As they left the courthouse, the judge turned to his sister. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice filled with determination. "But we're closer than we were before." She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Thank you," she said. "For everything." He shook his head. "Don't thank me. This is about more than just the land. It's about family. And I'm not going to let anyone take that away from us." As they walked away, the sun setting behind them, the judge felt a sense of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, he believed they might actually win. With the case reopened, the judge and his sister knew they had to dig deeper. The businessman's legal team would stop at nothing to protect their client's interests, and the siblings needed more than just Thomas's confession to prove their claim. They needed irrefutable evidence, something that would leave no room for doubt. Their next step was to visit the local archives, where decades of property records were stored. The building was old and dusty, the air thick with the scent of aging paper. They spent hours poring over documents, their eyes straining in the dim light as they searched for anything that might help their case. It was tedious work, but slowly, they began to piece together the story of the land. They found records of its original purchase by their great-grandfather, a hard-working farmer who had built a life for his family from nothing. They found tax records, maps, and even a few handwritten notes from their father, all of which confirmed the land had been in their family for generations. But the most important discovery came when they stumbled upon a faded, yellow document tucked away in a forgotten corner. It was a letter from their father to the local land registry, written shortly before his death. In it, he expressed his concerns about the land's ownership and his fear that it had been stolen from him. "This is it," the judge said, his voice filled with excitement. "This proves he never intended to sell the land. It was taken from him." His sister nodded, her eyes shining with hope. "We need to show this to the court. It's the proof we've been looking for." But as they left the archives, the judge couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. The businessman's lawyers were skilled and ruthless, and they would do everything in their power to discredit the new evidence. They needed more, something that would make it impossible for the court to ignore the truth. Their next stop was the town where their father had lived most of his life. They hoped to find people who had known him, people who might remember the circumstances surrounding the land sale. The town was small and close-knit, and it didn't take long for word to spread about their visit. Soon, they were approached by an elderly woman who had been a close friend of their father's. "I was wondering when you'd come," she said, her voice warm but tinged with sadness. "Your father was a good man. What happened to him? It wasn't right." She invited them into her home, where she shared stories about their father and the land he had loved so much. She also gave them a box of old photographs and letters, things she had kept safe for years. Among the items was a letter from Thomas, the lawyer, apologizing for what he had done. It was brief and vague, but it was enough to corroborate his testimony. "He wasn't a bad man," the woman said softly. "But he made a terrible mistake. He tried to make it right, but by then, it was too late." The judge and his sister thanked her, their hearts heavy with the weight of the past. They had uncovered so much, but they knew there was still more to learn. As they drove back to the city, the judge's sister broke the silence. "Do you think we'll ever know the whole story?" she asked. The judge sighed. "I don't know. But we've come this far. We can't stop now." When they returned to the courthouse, they presented the new evidence to their lawyer, who immediately began preparing for the next hearing. The case was gaining attention, and the media had started to take notice. Reporters crowded the courthouse steps, eager for a story. The judge knew the increased scrutiny was both a blessing and a curse. It put pressure on the businessman and his legal team, but it also meant their every move would be watched. The night before the hearing, the judge and his sister sat together in his study, going over their strategy. They were exhausted, but neither of them could sleep. "Do you think we'll win?" his sister asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The judge hesitated, then nodded. "We have the truth on our side. And sometimes, that's enough." But deep down, he knew the truth wasn't always enough. The law was complicated, and justice wasn't always served. All they could do was fight with everything they had and hope it would be enough to set things right. The day of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Reporters, spectators, and curious onlookers filled the seats, all eager to see how the case would unfold. The tension in the air was palpable, and the judge's sister could feel her heart pounding as she took her seat at the plaintiff's table. The businessman sat across the room, his face a mask of confidence. His lawyers were sharp and polished, their expressions calm and collected. They had won before, and they clearly believed they would win again. The judge overseeing the case entered the room, and everyone rose to their feet. She took her seat, her expression stern and unreadable, and called the court to order. The hearing began with the businessman's lawyers presenting their case. They argued that the new evidence was irrelevant, that the land had been sold legally, and that reopening the case was a waste of the court's time. They dismissed Thomas's confession as unreliable and questioned the authenticity of the old documents. But when it was their turn to speak, the judge's sister and her lawyer were ready. They presented the old deed, the letters, and the photographs, painting a vivid picture of the land's history and its importance to their family. They called Thomas to the stand, and once again, he recounted his story, his voice filled with regret and resolve. Then, they presented the letter from their father to the land registry, the one they had found in the archives. It was a powerful piece of evidence, and the courtroom fell silent as the judge read it aloud. "This land has been in my family for generations," the letter said. "It is my legacy, my heritage, and my responsibility to protect it. I fear that it has been taken from me, and I beg you to help me set things right." The businessman's lawyers tried to argue that the letter was irrelevant, that it didn't prove anything, but their objections were overruled. The judge overseeing the case was clearly moved by the evidence, and it was clear that the tide was turning. Finally, the judge's sister took the stand. She spoke about her father, about the memories she had of the land, and about the pain of losing it. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were filled with emotion as she described what the land meant to her and her family. "This isn't just about a piece of property," she said. "It's about my father's legacy. It's about honoring his memory and protecting what he worked so hard to build. I'm not just fighting for myself, I'm fighting for him." Her words resonated throughout the courtroom, and even the businessmen's lawyers seemed momentarily at a loss for words. When the hearing concluded, the judge overseeing the case called for a recess. She needed time to review the evidence and make her decision. The wait was agonizing. The judge and his sister sat together in the courthouse hallway, their nerves on edge. The day of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Reporters, spectators, and curious onlookers filled the seats, all eager to see how the case would unfold. The tension in the air was palpable, and the judge's sister could feel her heart pounding as she took her seat at the plaintiff's table. The businessman sat across the room, his face a mask of confidence. His lawyers were sharp and polished, their expressions calm and collected. They had won before, and they clearly believed they would win again. The judge overseeing the case entered the room, and everyone rose to their feet. She took her seat, her expression stern and unreadable, and called the court to order. The hearing began with the businessmen's lawyers presenting their case. They argued that the new evidence was irrelevant, that the land had been sold legally, and that reopening the case was a waste of the court's time. They dismissed Thomas's confession as unreliable and questioned the authenticity of the old documents. But when it was their turn to speak, the judge's sister and her lawyer were ready. They presented the old deed, the letters, and the photographs, painting a vivid picture of the land's history and its importance to their family. They called Thomas to the stand, and once again, he recounted his story, his voice filled with regret and resolve. Then, they presented the letter from their father to the land registry, the one they had found in the archives. It was a powerful piece of evidence, and the courtroom fell silent as the judge read it aloud. "This land has been in my family for generations," the letter said. "It is my legacy, my heritage, and my responsibility to protect it. I fear that it has been taken from me, and I beg you to help me set things right." The businessmen's lawyers tried to argue that the letter was irrelevant, that it didn't prove anything, but their objections were overruled. The judge overseeing the case was clearly moved by the evidence, and it was clear that the tide was turning. Finally, the judge's sister took the stand. She spoke about her father, about the memories she had of the land, and about the pain of losing it. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were filled with emotion as she described what the land meant to her and her family. "This isn't just about a piece of property," she said. "It's about my father's legacy. It's about honoring his memory and protecting what he worked so hard to build. I'm not just fighting for myself, I'm fighting for him." Her words resonated throughout the courtroom, and even the businessmen's lawyers seemed momentarily at a loss for words. When the hearing concluded, the judge overseeing the case called for a recess. She needed time to review the evidence and make her decision. The wait was agonizing. The judge and his sister sat together in the courthouse hallway, their nerves on edge. They had done everything they could, but they knew the outcome was out of their hands. Finally, the bailiff called them back into the courtroom. The judge took her seat, her expression unreadable, and the room fell silent. After reviewing the evidence and hearing the testimony, she began, her voice clear and authoritative, "I have reached a decision." She paused, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The evidence presented today has raised serious questions about the validity of the land sale. The letter from the plaintiff's father, combined with the testimony of Thomas and the historical documents, makes it clear that the land was taken from the plaintiff's family under false pretenses. Therefore, I rule in favor of the plaintiff. The land is to be returned to its rightful owner. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. The businessman's face turned red with anger, but he said nothing. His lawyers exchanged worried glances, clearly realizing they had lost. The judge's sister let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Tears filled her eyes as she turned to her brother, who was smiling for the first time in weeks. "We did it," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. He nodded, his own eyes shining with pride. "We did." As they left the courthouse, the sun shining brightly overhead, the judge felt a sense of relief and accomplishment he hadn't felt in a long time. They had fought for justice, and they had won. But as they celebrated their victory, the judge couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. The businessman wasn't the type to give up easily, and he knew the fight might not be over yet. The victory in court was a moment of triumph, but the judge and his sister knew their journey wasn't over yet. The businessman, furious at the ruling, immediately filed an appeal, determined to fight the decision. The legal battle dragged on for months, but the siblings refused to back down. They had come too far to give up now. During this time, the bond between the judge and his sister grew stronger. They spent countless hours together, not just working on the case but also getting to know each other. They shared stories about their lives, their dreams, and their regrets. For the first time, the judge felt like he had a true family, a connection that went beyond the law and the courtroom. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the appeal was denied. The court upheld the original ruling, and the land was officially returned to the judge's sister. It was a moment of pure joy and relief, but it was also bittersweet. The land was theirs again, but it couldn't erase the years they had lost or the pain they had endured. One sunny afternoon, the judge and his sister visited the land together. It was overgrown and neglected, a shadow of what it had once been, but it was still beautiful. They walked through the fields, their footsteps crunching on the dry grass, and talked about their plans for the future. "I want to restore it," his sister said, her eyes shining with determination. "I want to bring it back to life, the way it was when we were kids." The judge nodded, a smile playing on his lips. "I'll help you. We'll do it together." As they stood there, surrounded by the land that had brought them together, the judge felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The fight had been long and hard, but it had been worth it. They had not only reclaimed their family's legacy but also found each other in the process. In the months that followed, they worked tirelessly to restore the land. They cleared the overgrown fields, repaired the old farmhouse, and planted new crops. It was hard work, but it was also healing. With every tree they planted and every stone they moved, they felt a little more of the past's weight lift from their shoulders. The judge continued his work in the courtroom, but he approached it with a new perspective. He had always believed in the law, but now he understood that justice wasn't just about rules and evidence, it was about people. It was about doing what was right, even when it was hard. His sister, meanwhile, found a new sense of purpose. She had spent so much of her life feeling lost and alone, but now she had a home, a place where she belonged. She started a small community garden on the land, inviting neighbors and friends to help grow fruits and vegetables. It became a place of connection and healing, not just for her but for everyone who visited. One evening, as the sun set over the fields, the judge and his sister sat together on the porch of the farmhouse. The air was warm, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. "Do you think he would be proud of us?" his sister asked, her voice soft. The judge thought for a moment, then nodded. "I do. We fought for what was right, and we didn't give up. That's all he ever wanted for us." She smiled, her eyes filled with tears. "I wish he could see this. I wish he could see what we've done." "He can," the judge said gently. "And I think he's smiling." As they sat there, watching the stars come out one by one, the judge felt a deep sense of gratitude. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had brought them to this moment, a moment of peace, of connection, and of hope for the future. The land was more than just a piece of property. It was a symbol of their family's resilience, their love, and their determination to fight for what mattered most. And as they looked out over the fields, bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The story of the judge and his sister wasn't just about a courtroom battle or a piece of land. It was about family. About the bonds that tie us together, and about the power of truth and justice to heal even the deepest wounds. And as they sat there, side by side, they knew that their story was just beginning.